I've lived in the same house for 31 years, a two-story colonial on Maple Crest Drive in Dayton, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where the houses are far enough apart that you don't hear your neighbors unless something is actually wrong. I was 63 years old when the phone rang on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had just come in from taking the trash out, which I always do on Tuesday mornings, and my hands were cold from the air outside. I hadn't had my second cup of coffee yet. I let it ring once before I answered. Old habit. The voice on the other end identified himself as Detective Aaron Miles with the Columbus Police Department. He spoke the way detectives speak when they've had to make this kind of call before, measured, careful, but not unkind. He said there had been a death. A young man, 31 years old, found in his apartment 2 days prior. The cause was determined to be cardiac arrest related to a previously undiagnosed heart condition. He said the young man's name was Daniel Garrett. I told him I didn't know anyone by that name. There was a pause, not long, maybe 2 seconds. Detective Miles said he understood. And then he said something that I've replayed in my mind probably 1,000 times since. He said, "Mr. Calloway, the deceased listed you as his next of kin, as his father." I stood there in my kitchen with cold hands and half a cup of coffee going lukewarm on the counter, and I told him there must be a mistake. I told him I had 2 daughters. Catherine, who lives in Nashville with her husband and 3 kids, and Susan, who's in Portland doing something with environmental law that I'm still not entirely sure I understand. I told him. I had never had a son. I told him I was certain. Detective Miles said he understood. He said these things sometimes turned out to be clerical errors or mistaken identities. But he said, given the circumstances, they would appreciate it if I could come to Columbus to help clarify. He gave me an address. He was professional about it. He thanked me for my time. After I hung up, I stood at that counter for a while. I'm not sure how long. I looked out the window at the backyard, the oak tree I planted when Catherine was born, the fence I put up myself in 1998. Nothing had changed out there. Same fence, same tree, same yard. But something had shifted in a way I didn't have language for yet. I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who panics. I spent 28 years in insurance claims investigation before I retired. My job, for most of my working life, was to walk into situations that were already broken and understand what actually happened versus what people said happened. I learned early that the first account of anything is rarely the complete one. You listen, you document, you follow the trail where it goes, not where you want it to go. So I did what I always do when something doesn't add up. I didn't call my daughters. Not yet. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't make assumptions. I wrote down the detective's name, his badge number, the address he gave me, and the young man's full name, Daniel Garrett, on a notepad I keep by the phone. Then I went and got dressed. Some people, when faced with something they don't understand, look for the fastest explanation that lets them go back to normal. I've never been built that way. In my experience, the fastest explanation is usually the one that causes the most damage later. I drove to Columbus that same afternoon. It's about an hour and 15 minutes from Dayton, depending on traffic. I took I-70 East, and I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove and let myself think. I thought about the detective's voice. He hadn't seemed confused. He had seemed like a man who had already done some verification before picking up the phone. That was the detail that stayed with me during that drive. Men like him don't usually call on incomplete information. I didn't know it then. But that drive east on a cold Tuesday in March was the beginning of something I hadn't asked for and wasn't prepared for. A story that wasn't mine until it was. The address Detective Miles gave me was not the county morgue. It was the precinct on East Broad Street, a 3-story building with a parking lot that needed repaving and a lobby that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. The kind of institutional smell I recognized. I'd spent enough time in buildings like that over the years. A young officer at the front desk walked me back to a small conference room. Fluorescent lights, a table with 4 chairs, a whiteboard on the wall that had been partially erased, but you could still make out what looked like case numbers underneath the ghost of the marker. Detective Miles came in a few minutes later. He was younger than his voice suggested, maybe late 30s, with the kind of tired in his eyes that had nothing to do with sleep. He shook my hand and sat down across from me and placed a manila folder on the table between us. He didn't open it right away. He thanked me for making the drive. I told him I appreciated the call and that I wanted to understand what was happening. He nodded. And then he said something I wasn't prepared for. He said, "Mr. Calloway, before we discuss the identification, I want you to know that Daniel Garrett did not die under ordinary circumstances. He died of natural causes, that part is confirmed. But in the weeks before his death, he was cooperating with our department on an ongoing investigation. He came to us voluntarily, and part of what he provided before he passed was documentation that connects his birth history to you." I looked at him. I asked him what kind of documentation. He said, "A DNA test, registered through a licensed genealogy lab. The results are on file. According to those results, with a confidence interval of 99.97%, you are his biological father." The room didn't go quiet. The fluorescent lights kept humming. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped, but something in me went very still. I don't remember exactly how long I sat in that chair after Detective Miles said those words. I remember looking down at the table. There was a scratch in the surface near the edge, a long diagonal line, like someone had dragged a key across it once, a long time ago. I focused on that scratch for a moment. I don't know why. Sometimes the mind needs somewhere small to land before it can process something large. Detective Miles gave me that space. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances or explanations. He just waited. I appreciated that more than I could have told him at the time. I asked him how old the test was. He said Daniel had taken it approximately 14 months before his death. Through a private lab, licensed, accredited, the results legally admissible. He said Daniel had submitted it as part of his cooperation with the department, not as evidence in the traditional sense, but as context, as background for what he was trying to tell them. I asked if I could see it. He opened the folder then, slid a single page across the table. I put on my reading glasses and I looked at it the way I've looked at thousands of documents over the course of my career, carefully, top to bottom. I read the lab name, the accreditation number, the methodology summary. I read the confidence interval again, 99.97%. In claims investigation, you learn that numbers don't have emotions. They don't want anything. They don't protect anyone. They just reflect what is. That number 99.97 wasn't trying to hurt me. It was just true. I set the page down and asked Detective Miles how Daniel had obtained my DNA for the comparison. He said Daniel had used a public ancestry database, the kind where people submit their own profiles, hoping to find distant relatives. My younger daughter Susan had submitted her profile to one of those platforms about 3 years prior. She'd mentioned it to me once, something about tracing family history on her mother's side. I hadn't paid much attention to it at the time. Daniel had found Susan through that database. The system had flagged her as a likely half-sibling match. He hadn't contacted her. He hadn't contacted me either. He had simply used that match to extrapolate the paternal connection and then confirmed it through a direct test using a DNA sample he had collected legally, through a licensed service cross-referenced against the shared markers with Susan's public profile. The whole thing was methodical, careful, patient. I remember thinking, sitting in that room under those humming lights, that whoever this young man had been, he thought the way I think. I didn't say that out loud. Detective Miles told me he'd give me some time and stepped out of the room. A younger officer brought in a cup of coffee, real coffee, not the lobby version, and set it down without a word. I sat there with that folder and I let my mind go back. Not because I wanted to, but because it had to. There are things in a man's past that he doesn't revisit often. Not because he's hiding from them, but because they've been filed away, processed, and closed. That's what I thought, anyway. Her name was Renata. We were married for 6 years. We met when I was 26, married at 28, and by the time I was 34, the marriage was over in every way that mattered before the paperwork made it official. I remember the morning I moved out of the house we'd rented on Fieldstone Avenue. It was August. Hot in the way August gets in Ohio, thick, heavy, the kind of heat that makes everything feel slower than it should. I carried boxes to my car in 2 trips and I didn't look back at the front door. Not because I was angry. I was past anger by then. I was just done. Renata stood on the porch. She said, "You're going to regret leaving." I didn't answer her. I got in the car and I drove away. I've thought about that moment many times over the years. Not with regret, exactly. More with the particular weight of things that were said and not said between two people who had already stopped speaking the same language. What I know now, what I didn't know then, is that at the time I drove away from that house on Fieldstone Avenue, Renata was already pregnant. That realization didn't come to me all at once in that conference room. It came the way most realizations come slowly, in pieces, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. You watch the image emerge and at first you tell yourself it might be something else, and then the lines sharpen and you see what it actually is. I sat there doing the arithmetic. The marriage ended in the fall of 1992. Daniel Garrett had been 31 years old when he died. That put his birth year at approximately 1993. Roughly 7 to 9 months after I moved out, I took off my glasses and set them on the table. The math was not ambiguous. There's a diner on the edge of my old neighborhood in Dayton called Hendrick's. It's been there since before I was born, probably. The kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that comes in those thick ceramic mugs that hold the heat for a long time. I used to go there on Saturday mornings when my girls were little. Catherine would always order the blueberry pancakes and then eat half of them and try to give the rest to Susan, who didn't want them but accepted them anyway because that's just who Susan is. I remember one particular Saturday Catherine must have been about 7. She looked up at me over her pancakes and said, "Dad, do you know everything?" I told her no. I told her, "Nobody knows everything." She thought about that for a second and then went back to her pancakes, apparently satisfied. I've thought about that morning more than once since that Tuesday in Columbus. The ordinary weight of a Saturday morning. The way a child asks a question without understanding the full size of what they're asking. I didn't know everything. I didn't know I had a son. Detective Miles came back into the room after about 20 minutes. He sat down and he folded his hands on the table in that deliberate way people do when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. He told me that Daniel's death, while natural in cause, had occurred at a critical point in the investigation he had been assisting. He told me that Daniel had spent the better part of 2 years quietly assembling documentation related to what Miles described as an organized infant trafficking network that had operated in and around Central Ohio in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He told me that Daniel had come forward not because he'd been caught up in something, but because he had gone looking for the truth about himself and had found something much larger. He said the investigation was ongoing. He said several individuals had already been identified, including a retired family law attorney and 2 former hospital employees. Then he slid another document across the table, not a DNA report this time, a photocopy of a hospital birth record, Columbus General, dated June 4th, 1993. Mother, Renata Calloway. Father, James Calloway. My name, my signature on the paternal acknowledgement line. I looked at that signature for a long time. I've signed my name thousands of times in my life. Insurance forms, mortgage documents, birthday cards, tax returns. I know my own signature the way you know your own face. The way it starts with the looping J, the way the L's in Calloway connect without lifting the pen. The signature on that birth record was close, but it wasn't mine. I said that out loud, quietly. That's not my signature. Detective Miles nodded slowly. He said, "We know." That was the moment the temperature in the room shifted. Not dramatically, nothing broke. No one raised their voice. But something structural changed in my understanding of what I was sitting inside. This wasn't a clerical error. This wasn't a confused young man reaching out to the wrong person. This was something deliberate. Something that had been constructed carefully, illegally 31 years ago, while I was driving away from a house on Fieldstone Avenue thinking I was simply ending a marriage. I thought about Renata on that porch. You're going to regret leaving. I hadn't understood what she meant, not even close. Some people mistake a closed door for the end of a story. They don't consider what might be written on the other side of it. I folded my hands on the table the way Miles had folded his, and I asked him what he needed from me. He said, "For now, just your patience, and whatever you can remember." I told him I had both. Detective Miles asked me to come back the following morning. He said there were people he wanted me to speak with, a victim advocate from the DA's office, and a woman named Patricia Okafor, who was the lead investigator on the trafficking case. He said they had been building the file for 8 months and that my arrival, in a manner of speaking, had been anticipated. That last part stayed with me on the drive back to Dayton. Anticipated, not hoped for, not requested, anticipated, as if Daniel had already told them I would come. I stopped for gas outside of London, Ohio, the small town halfway between Columbus and Dayton that most people drive through without noticing. The kind of place with a single stoplight and a grain elevator visible from the highway. I stood at the pump in the cold and watched a freight truck pull through the intersection and disappear west. And I thought about a 31-year-old man I had never met who had apparently known more about me than I had known about him. He had done a DNA test. He had found my daughter in a database. He had confirmed the connection. He had assembled evidence. He had gone to the police. And at some point in all of that, while doing all of that, he had decided not to call me. I didn't know what to do with that yet. I filed it away and drove home. That night I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I didn't eat much. I made a sandwich around 8 o'clock and ate half of it standing at the counter, which is a habit my daughters have always disapproved of. I looked at the notepad by the phone where I had written Daniel Garrett's name that morning. I thought about whether to call Catherine or Susan. I picked up the phone twice and set it back down both times, not because I was keeping something from them. I don't operate that way, but because I didn't have enough of the shape of it yet. I've learned over the years that telling people half a story often does more damage than waiting for the whole one. They fill in the gaps with fear. You can't blame them for that. It's what people do. So I waited. I went upstairs and found an old shoebox in the back of the closet in the spare room, the room that used to be Susan's before she left for college. Inside the box were documents from the divorce, papers I hadn't looked at in probably 15 years, the separation agreement, the final decree, the property settlement. I sat on the edge of the bed and went through them slowly. Renata and I had divided things simply. There wasn't much to divide. We didn't own the house, we rented it. We had one joint account that was split down the middle. No children listed in the custody arrangements, no dependents. Just two people untangling themselves from a thing that hadn't worked. I looked at those papers for a long time, particularly the dates. The divorce was finalized in February of 1993. Daniel was born in June of 1993. The pregnancy, if my arithmetic was right, would have begun sometime in the fall of 1992 while we were still technically married. While we were still living in the same house, even if we were living in it like two people waiting for a bus going in different directions, she had known. When she stood on that porch and said I would regret leaving, she had already known. I put the papers back in the box and sat there in the quiet of that spare room for a while. Susan's old glow-in-the-dark star stickers were still on the ceiling. She'd put them up when she was 9. Neither of us had ever taken them down. The next morning I drove back to Columbus. Patricia Okafor was not what I expected, though I'm not sure what I expected exactly. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped hair and the kind of stillness that comes from years of watching people carefully. She wore a dark blazer and small silver earrings, and she shook my hand with a firmness that felt like a statement. She had a yellow legal pad on the table in front of her, already filled with notes. Not for show, the pages were worn at the edges, the ink dense and deliberate. This was someone who had been living inside this case for a long time. She thanked me for coming, and then she got right to it. No preamble, no excessive sympathy. She said, "Mr. Calloway, What I'm about to walk you through is going to be difficult. I want you to know that you are not under any obligation here. You're here voluntarily and you can leave at any time, but I think you should hear this. I told her to go ahead. She opened a second folder thicker than the one Miles had shown me the day before, and she laid out the structure of what they had found with the calm efficiency of someone explaining a building's floor plan. Matter of fact, precise, no drama in her voice, just information moving from one place to another. She said that beginning in approximately 1988 and continuing through at least 1995, a network of individuals operating primarily out of Columbus and its surrounding counties had been facilitating the illegal sale of newborns. The operation worked through a combination of hospital staff primarily in labor and delivery, a licensed family law attorney named Gerald Foss, and a small number of intermediaries who identified prospective buyers. Buyers were typically affluent couples who had either been denied through legitimate adoption channels or who wanted to avoid the legal scrutiny of the formal process. Biological mothers were recruited and in some cases coerced into surrendering their infants in exchange for cash payments. In cases where the biological father was absent or unaware, forged signatures were used on the paternal consent documentation. She paused there and looked at me. I said, "Like mine." She said, "Like yours, Gerald Foss." I wrote the name down on the notepad I had brought with me. Old habit. Writing things down slows the processing just enough to catch details you might otherwise skip past. Patricia told me that Foss had retired from practice in 2011. He was 72 years old now and living in a suburb east of Columbus called Reynoldsburg. He had a clean public record, no disciplinary actions through the state bar, no prior charges, the kind of man who, from the outside, looked like a quiet retirement. A settled life. She said Daniel had identified Foss on his own, roughly 10 months before his death. She said Daniel had obtained a copy of his own original adoption file through a legal records request. Ohio had opened access to original birth certificates for adoptees in 2015, and in that file he found the name of the attorney who had handled the placement, Gerald Foss. From there, Daniel had done what careful people do. He pulled public records. He found other adoptions handled by Foss during the same period. He cross-referenced birth dates, hospital records where accessible, and public ancestry databases. Over approximately 8 months, he had identified 11 other individuals he believed had been placed through the same network. 11, not counting himself. Patricia said. He built most of this from his kitchen table, working evenings and weekends. He had a full-time job. He was a structural engineer in Dublin, Ohio. He did this on his own time. I looked down at the notepad, the name Gerald Foss, the number 11 written next to it. I thought about a young man I had never met, sitting at a kitchen table at night, pulling threads, methodical, patient, building something out of documents and databases and quiet determination. That thought hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. I kept my face still. I've had a lot of practice at that. There is a particular kind of institutional moment that I recognize from my years in claims work. It happens when the documentation has moved far enough ahead of the people involved that the outcome becomes structural rather than personal. The evidence has its own momentum. The process does not require emotion to function. It simply requires that the facts be placed in the correct order. Patricia Okafor reached that point with quiet authority about 40 minutes into our conversation. She said that Daniel had delivered his compiled evidence to the Columbus PD 8 months prior. She said that in the months following, the department had verified and expanded his findings. Warrants had been issued. Financial records subpoenaed. 2 of the former hospital employees, both retired, had already been interviewed under caution. Foss had been interviewed once, through his attorney, and had provided what Patricia described without inflection as a carefully managed non-answer. She said that Daniel's death, while natural in medical terms, had occurred before he could be formally interviewed on the record. That was a gap in the evidentiary record. Not fatal to the case, but a gap. Then she said, before he died, Daniel filed a sworn affidavit with this department detailing his own experience and his investigative findings. It's on record. It's admissible. She paused. He also left something for you personally. We've been holding it pending your contact with us. I asked her what it was. She reached into the folder and produced a sealed envelope, standard white. My name written on the front in careful block letters, James Calloway. She slid it across the table and folded her hands and looked at me with an expression that was professional and human at the same time. She said, "You don't have to open it here." I looked at the envelope for a moment, my name in block letters, written by someone who had known my name for 14 months and had chosen, for reasons I didn't yet understand, not to use it to find me directly. I picked it up and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I told Patricia I had some questions about the legal structure of the case. I told her I wanted to understand what role, if any, I might formally play going forward. I told her I had spent nearly 3 decades in insurance claims investigation and that I was familiar with evidentiary procedure, chain of custody documentation, and institutional review processes. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she said, "Detective Miles mentioned you might say something like that." I asked her what Miles had said exactly. She almost smiled. She said, "He said you seemed like someone who processes things by finding out what needs to be done next." I told her that was accurate. She picked up her legal pad and uncapped her pen. She said, "Then let's talk about what needs to be done next." Patricia Okafor gave me 3 things before I left that second meeting. The first was a case reference number and a direct line to her office. The second was a 2-page summary of the investigation's current status, redacted in places, but substantive enough to understand the architecture of what Daniel had built. The third was the name and contact information for Daniel's adoptive family. She said they had been informed of the investigation and were cooperative. She said they were good people who were grieving. I drove back to Dayton with all 3 things sitting on the passenger seat. That evening, I finally called Catherine. I sat in the living room with the lamp on and the television off, and I told her as much as I understood at that point. I kept my voice level. I went in order: the phone call, the drive to Columbus, the DNA result, the birth record, the forged signature. I gave her the facts in sequence, the way I would have written them in a claims report. No editorializing. No speculation beyond what had been confirmed. There was a long silence on her end when I finished. Then she said, "Dad, you had a son." Not a question. Just the fact of it, spoken out loud by someone else for the first time. Something about hearing it in her voice, her particular voice, which I have known since she was an hour old, made it real in a way that all the documents and conference rooms hadn't quite managed. I told her yes, it appeared that way. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was functioning fine and that I would keep her informed as I learned more. She knew better than to push past that with me. She gets that from her mother, the ability to read when a person needs the conversation to stay practical rather than go somewhere else. Before she hung up, she said, "He would have been my brother." I didn't answer that. I just said goodnight. I opened the letter the following morning. I'd left it on the kitchen table overnight. I'm not sure why I waited. Maybe I needed the night between me and it. Maybe I just wasn't ready to hear whatever was inside it while I was still in the middle of processing everything else. I've learned over the years that there's a difference between being ready to receive information and simply being willing to receive it. I was willing the night before. I wasn't ready until morning. I made coffee. I sat down at the table in the early light. I put on my reading glasses. The letter was handwritten. 4 pages, front and back, on plain white paper. The handwriting was small, and even the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who thinks carefully before committing pen to paper. The kind that doesn't rush. It began without a salutation. No "Dear Mr. Calloway," no "Dear Dad." It just began. I've started this letter more times than I can count. The first version I wrote was angry. The second was too formal. I burned 3 drafts before I realized I was writing them for the wrong reason. I was writing to explain myself. And that's not what this needs to be. What this needs to be is honest. My name is Daniel. I'm 31 years old. I'm a structural engineer. I like bad science fiction movies and good coffee. And I have a dog named Archie. who I am genuinely concerned about in a way that probably seems disproportionate given everything else I'm trying to say. Here, my adoptive parents are Robert and Carol Garrett of Westerville, Ohio. They are good people. They gave me everything a person could reasonably ask for and more. I want you to know that before anything else. Whatever was done, whatever was taken from both of us, it was not done by them. They adopted me in good faith through what they believed was a legitimate process. They didn't know. I found out about the DNA match to your daughter 14 months ago. I sat with that information for a long time before I did anything with it. I want to be honest about why I didn't contact you directly. I was afraid, not of you. I don't think I was afraid of you. I was afraid of what it would mean. I was afraid that showing up in your life would be an intrusion you hadn't asked for and didn't want. I was afraid that you would look at me and see evidence of something painful from your past, rather than a person. I was afraid that I had already caused enough disruption simply by existing, and that adding myself to your life would only cause more. I know that sounds like a strange thing for a grown man to say. I'm aware of that. But there's another reason I didn't come to you directly, and I want to be honest about this too. By the time I confirmed the DNA match, I already knew about Foss. I already knew about the network. I already had most of what became the evidence file. And I knew that the moment I walked into your life, things would become complicated in ways I couldn't fully control. I didn't want you involved in something dangerous before the people responsible had been identified. I didn't want to be the reason something happened to you. So I went to the police instead. I filed the evidence. I gave them everything I had. I made sure the record existed somewhere that couldn't be lost or erased. And then I wrote this letter. I don't have an ending prepared for this. I'm not good at endings. What I want you to know, what I most want you to know, is that whatever was taken from us, it wasn't your fault. You didn't leave me. You didn't know I existed. The man who drove away from a house on Fieldstone Avenue in August of 1992 was not a man who abandoned his son. He was a man who didn't know he had one. I know that because I investigated it. I know your file the way I know a structural diagram. I know where the load points are and where the fractures are and where the integrity you held. I'm sorry I never had the courage to call you. I think you would have been worth knowing. Daniel, I set the letter down on the table. Outside the window, the backyard was the same as it always is. The oak tree, the fence. The particular quiet of a weekday morning in a neighborhood where most people have already left for work. I sat there for a long time. He knew about Fieldstone Avenue. He had researched that. He had found the address of the house where his parents' marriage had ended, and he had put it in a letter to a man he had never met as a way of saying, I know you. I know the shape of you. You are not a stranger to me, even though I am a stranger to you. That's when the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. I called Robert Garrett on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after reading the letter. I had thought carefully about what I wanted to say, and then decided to set all of it aside and simply introduce myself and let the conversation go where it needed to go. In my experience, prepared speeches rarely survive contact with a real human being on the other end of a phone line. Robert Garrett answered on the second ring. He had a steady voice, the kind that had probably been steadier before the last few weeks. He said he had been hoping I would call. We talked for 40 minutes. I learned that Robert was a retired high school principal, and that Carol taught piano lessons from their home and had done so for 30 years. I learned that Daniel had been a quiet child who became a methodical adult, that he had always needed to understand the why of things before he could accept them. That he had taken the DNA test not out of resentment, but out of what Robert called a need for completeness. Robert said. He used to say that a structure is only as sound as its foundation. He wasn't talking about buildings when he said that. I wrote that down. Robert told me that in the months before his death, Daniel had been working long hours on the evidence file. That he had seemed focused in a way that was different from his usual concentration, heavier somehow, more urgent. That he had told his parents, toward the end, that he needed to finish something before he could move forward. He hadn't told them what moving forward would look like. He hadn't told them about the letter. When Robert found out about it after the police had contacted him, He had sat in Daniel's old bedroom for a long time. He told me that without any particular expression in his voice, just as a fact. The way men of a certain age and temperament report the things that broke them open quietly, as if the quietness is a form of respect for the weight of it. I understood that completely. I drove to Westerville on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after my first conversation with Patricia Okafor. Robert and Carol Garrett lived in a ranch house on a cul-de-sac with a well-kept yard and a basketball hoop in the driveway that had probably stood there since Daniel was a teenager. Carol met me at the door. She was a small woman with careful eyes and the kind of composure that I recognized as hard-won rather than natural. She shook my hand and held it for just a moment longer than a standard handshake. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They had made coffee and set out a plate of things on the kitchen table. The kitchen was warm and organized and had a calendar on the wall with Carol's piano students' names written in different colors for different days. The ordinary furniture of a life well lived. Robert brought out a box, not a large box, shoebox-sized actually, which struck me with an irony I kept to myself. He set it on the table and said it was Daniel's research materials, the physical copies of what he'd assembled. He said the police had the digital files, but Daniel had always kept paper backups. He said he wanted me to have them. I looked at that box for a moment. Then I looked at Robert and Carol Garrett, two people who had raised a child they hadn't known was taken from someone else, who had loved him without reservation, who had lost him, and who were now sitting across a kitchen table from the biological father they had never met, trying to figure out how to hold all of that at once. I thought about what Daniel had written. They didn't know. I told them that. I said it plainly. I said I had read the letter, and I understood that they had acted in good faith, and that nothing about my being here was about blame directed at them. I said that what I wanted, what I intended, was to finish what Daniel had started. Carol looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she looked up at me. She said, "He would have liked you." I didn't trust my voice entirely right at that moment, so I just nodded. Robert pushed the box toward me. I put my hand on it the way you put your hand on something you intend to carry for a long time. I spent the better part of 2 weeks going through Daniel's box. I did it the way I would have approached a complex claims file in my working years, methodically, in order, without jumping ahead. I cleared the dining room table, which I rarely use since it's just me in the house, and I laid everything out in chronological sequence: birth records, adoption filings, attorney correspondence, financial documents, cross-referenced ancestry profiles, handwritten notes in Daniel's small, even script on yellow legal paper. He had organized it the way an engineer organizes a structural assessment. Each section labeled, each document sourced, margins annotated with references to corroborating materials. He had even created a timeline on a single large sheet of paper, the kind of long horizontal timeline I used to draw on whiteboards during case reviews, mapping the network's activity from its earliest identifiable transaction in 1988 through what he believed was its final placement in 1996, 12 placements total, 12 children, 12 families who had paid for them. I sat with that number for a while. 12 is not an abstraction. 12 is a school classroom. 12 is a year's worth of monthly meetings. 12 is enough to constitute a pattern so deliberate and sustained that the word network stops feeling like a legal term and starts feeling like exactly what it is: a structure built by people who believed they would never be held accountable for what they built. The financial trail was where Daniel had done his most careful work. Gerald Foss had not been careless, but he had made the mistake that careful people often make when they believe they are operating in permanent safety. He had been consistent. Consistency over time leaves marks. Daniel had traced a series of payments ranging from $18,000 to $45,000 per placement through a pattern of shell transactions that moved money from prospective adoptive families into what appeared on paper to be a legal services retainer account held by Foss's firm. From there, the money moved in smaller increments, split, redirected, filtered through what Daniel had labeled in his notes as a layering sequence, eventually landing in accounts that bore no obvious connection to adoption services. He had flagged 3 specific account numbers with a red marker and written a single word next to each one. Verify. He hadn't been able to verify them himself before he died. That was the gap, the thread he'd pulled as far as he could reach. I called Patricia Okafor on a Monday morning and told her what I'd found in the box. She listened without interrupting another quality I had come to appreciate about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said they had identified 2 of those 3 accounts through their own subpoena process. The third was still pending a response from the financial institution involved. She said the account was held at a regional bank in central Ohio under the name of a property management LLC that had been dissolved in 2004. She said the dissolution paperwork had been filed by an attorney. I asked her which attorney. She said, Gerald Foss. I wrote that down, underlined it once. She said that Foss had been contacted again through his attorney for a second interview, that he had declined. That his attorney had responded with a letter characterizing the investigation as a misapplication of resources toward a retired private citizen, based on the unverified claims of a deceased individual. She read me that phrase once and then set it down. I said, unverified claims of a deceased individual. She said, that's what it says. I thought about Daniel at his kitchen table, evenings and weekends. 14 months of quiet, careful, documented work. 11 other people identified. Financial records traced. A sworn affidavit filed. Unverified claims. I kept my voice even. I asked Patricia what the evidentiary threshold was for the next stage of the process, specifically whether a formal grand jury referral had been considered. She said it was under active review by the DA's office. I asked if there was anything that would accelerate that review. She paused. Then she said, corroborating testimony from additional affected parties would strengthen the case considerably, particularly from anyone with direct standing, meaning a biological parent whose parental rights were terminated without their knowledge or consent. I let that sit for exactly 1 second. Then I said, tell me what that process looks like. The DA's office occupied the 4th floor of the Franklin County Courthouse on Mound Street in Columbus. High ceilings, old marble floors, the kind of building that was designed to communicate the weight of institutional authority through its architecture alone. I had been in buildings like it before, not as a subject, but as an investigator providing testimony on complex claims cases. I knew how to walk into a room like that without the building intimidating me into smallness. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case was a woman named Claire Novak, mid-40s. Sharp in the way that people are sharp when they've spent years in a profession that rewards precision and punishes sloppiness. She had Daniel's full evidence file on her desk in 2 binders, the kind with color-coded tabs, and she had clearly read it thoroughly because when I sat down across from her, she didn't reach for it once during our conversation. She already had it. She explained the process with the same calm efficiency Patricia used, apparently a quality valued in that building. She said the grand jury referral was being prepared. She said the financial subpoenas were producing results. She said, the 2 former hospital employees who had already been interviewed, a retired labor and delivery nurse named Sylvia Brandt and a former hospital administrator named Thomas Ewell, had both provided information that corroborated Daniel's timeline, though neither had yet agreed to formal cooperation. She said Foss remained the central figure. She said that without his cooperation or a direct financial link to the placement payments, the case was strong but not yet airtight. Then she said something that recalibrated my understanding of where things stood. She said, Mr. Calloway, Gerald Foss has been aware of this investigation for approximately 6 months. In that time, he has made 3 significant financial transactions. He transferred the title of a property in Licking County to his adult son. He liquidated a brokerage account valued at approximately $230,000. And he made a series of wire transfers to an account in a jurisdiction that requires a separate legal process to access. She let that information stand on its own for a moment. I said, he's moving assets. She said, he is attempting to. She paused. An asset protection freeze has been filed. The property transfer is under review for fraudulent conveyance. The brokerage liquidation was flagged by the institution's own compliance department before it was fully processed, which is why we know about it. I thought about what Daniel had written in his notes next to those 3 account numbers. Verify. He had known there was money being moved. He had known that the financial structure was the pressure point. He just hadn't had the institutional authority to apply pressure to it directly. That's what the DA's office was for. I gave my formal statement to Claire Novak and an investigator from the Financial Crimes Unit on the following Thursday. It took 4 hours. I went through everything in sequence: my marriage to Renata, the timeline of our separation, the divorce finalization, the specific dates. I confirmed that the signature on Daniel's birth record was not mine. I confirmed that I had never been contacted about any pregnancy, any birth, any adoption proceeding. I confirmed that I had never signed any document surrendering parental rights because I had never been given the opportunity to. The investigator, a quiet man named Holloway who took notes by hand the entire time without looking up, asked me at one point whether I had any current knowledge of Renata's whereabouts. I told him I didn't. I told him we had had no contact since the divorce was finalized in 1993. I told him I would not be able to say with certainty whether she had acted alone or under pressure from Foss or others in the network. Holloway looked up from his notepad then, just briefly. He said, "That's a fair distinction." I appreciated that he heard it. There are moments in a long institutional process when the machinery shifts from gathering to moving. When enough pieces have been placed correctly that the structure starts to bear its own weight, and the outcome becomes less a matter of effort and more a matter of time. I recognized that shift about 3 weeks after my formal statement. Patricia called me on a Friday evening, not from her office line, from her cell, which I took as a signal that the conversation was informal but meaningful. She said that Sylvia Brandt, the retired nurse, had agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge on a related count. She said Brandt had confirmed that at least 6 of the 12 placements on Daniel's timeline had involved hospital staff falsifying birth documentation. She said Brandt had identified Foss as the organizer and confirmed that biological mothers had been approached during prenatal care appointments, specifically targeting women in unstable situations. Women who were young or alone or financially pressured. She said one of the methods used to ensure paternal consent documents were signed or appeared signed was to approach fathers who were absent or recently separated before the birth records were filed. In some cases, signatures were obtained under false pretenses. In others, they were simply forged. I asked her which category mine fell into. She said, "Yours was forged. Foss signed your name himself. We have a sample comparison that confirms it." I sat with that for a moment. Not with anger. I was past the stage where anger was the primary instrument. With something quieter, a kind of structural clarity. Gerald Foss had sat in an office somewhere in Columbus in the spring of 1993 and signed my name to a document that erased my son from my life before I knew he existed. He had done it as a transaction, as a line item, as part of a process he had refined across 12 separate cases over 8 years. He had mistaken my absence for permission. That was his error, not the forgery itself. The forgery was the mechanism. The error was the assumption underneath it. The belief that a man who doesn't know something has no claim to it. That silence is the same as surrender. It isn't. The week after Patricia's call, 2 things happened in quick succession. The first was that the Franklin County grand jury returned an indictment. Gerald Foss was charged on 11 counts including fraud, conspiracy, falsification of legal documents, and violations of Ohio's adoption statutes. Thomas Ewell, the former hospital administrator, was charged on 4 counts. 2 other individuals identified through Brandt's cooperation whose names had not yet been made public were charged on related counts. The second was that I got a call from a woman named Margaret Cho. She said she was 30 years old. She said she had been adopted through what she now believed was the same network. She said she had read a brief news item about the indictment and had spent 3 days working up the courage to call the number listed in the article. She said she didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but that she needed to talk to someone who understood what this was. She had called the DA's office. They had given her Patricia's number. Patricia had given her mine. I sat at my kitchen table and I listened to Margaret Cho talk for 20 minutes. I didn't offer analysis or procedure. I just listened. At the end, she said she was sorry for taking up my time. I told her she hadn't taken up my time. I told her she had used it correctly. She asked me what I thought she should do next. I told her to call Patricia Okafor and to write down everything she remembered, in order, starting from the beginning. I told her that the details she thought were too small to matter were probably the ones that mattered most. She asked me how I knew that. I told her I'd spent 30 years learning it. After I hung up, I sat there for a while. Then I opened Daniel's timeline, the long horizontal sheet he'd drawn by hand, and I looked at the 12 marks on it. 12 points on a line. 12 lives whose foundations had been altered before they were old enough to understand what a foundation was. He had started to give them back their history. I intended to finish it. The arraignment was on a Wednesday morning in April. I drove to Columbus and sat in the public gallery of Courtroom 4B on the 3rd floor of the Franklin County Courthouse. I arrived early enough to get a seat near the aisle. Old habit, I like to be able to see the room clearly without craning. The gallery was not full. These things rarely are at the arraignment stage. There were a handful of journalists in the back rows with notebooks and the particular alert stillness of people waiting for a usable sentence. There were a few individuals I didn't recognize who had the look of people with a personal stake in the proceedings, quiet, composed, watching the door. I wondered how many of them were connected to the other cases on Daniel's timeline. Robert and Carol Garrett were there. They sat 3 rows ahead of me. Carol had her hands folded in her lap. Robert sat very straight. I caught his eye when he turned and he gave me a small nod, nothing theatrical. Just an acknowledgement between 2 people who understood what the morning meant. Gerald Foss entered with his attorney at 9:17 a.m. I want to be accurate about this because accuracy matters to me. I had no idea what I expected to feel when I saw him. I had spent weeks reading documents that bore his name, looking at a forged signature he had produced, building a procedural understanding of a man I had never encountered in person. I had constructed a functional picture of him from evidence. That's a different thing from seeing a person walk into a room. He was 72 years old. He wore a dark suit that fit well and moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that every physical detail in a courtroom is observed. His attorney was younger, 50s, silver-haired, the kind of polish that comes from billing $400 an hour for enough years that it becomes a form of identity. Foss sat down at the defense table and arranged himself in his chair and looked straight ahead at the bench. Not at the gallery, not at the prosecutor's table, straight ahead. The performance of a man who has decided that composure is his best available asset. I watched him, and I thought about something Patricia had told me during one of our conversations. She had said that in her experience, people who commit sustained institutional crimes over long periods of time develop a particular relationship with their own behavior. They stop thinking of it as crime. They think of it as management, as problem-solving. They have organized the discomfort out of it through repetition until what remains is simply a system that works. The system had worked for Gerald Foss for a long time. Until a 31-year-old structural engineer in Dublin, Ohio, sat down at his kitchen table on an evening in 2022 and started pulling threads. The judge entered, and the room stood and sat again in that particular institutional rhythm that reminds you that what is happening here is not personal, it is procedural. It is a structure designed to process facts and produce outcomes, regardless of what any individual in the room would prefer those outcomes to be. The charges were read. 11 counts. The clerk's voice was flat and precise, moving through each one. When the judge asked for Foss's plea, his attorney spoke. Not guilty on all counts. The judge set a trial date for the following October. Bail was set with conditions, surrender of passport, travel restricted to Franklin County. The asset freeze remained in place pending further financial review. Foss's attorney began to object to the asset freeze on the grounds that his client had not been convicted of any financial crime. and that the freeze constituted an undue burden on a private citizen. The judge looked at him over her glasses with an expression that I can only describe as institutional patience, the look of someone who has heard this particular argument enough times to have developed a specific face for it. She said the freeze would remain in place pending the outcome of the financial crimes review, and that counsel was welcome to file a written motion if he wished to contest it further. She said it the way you say something when you already know how it ends. Foss's attorney sat down. Authority doesn't come from saying something loudest. It comes from the structure that was already in place before anyone walked into the room. I didn't stay for the remainder of the morning session. I had said what I needed to say in my formal statement. The machinery was moving under its own weight now. My presence in that gallery was not procedural, it was personal. And having done what I came to do, I walked out into the corridor and stood by a window that looked out over Mound Street and let the morning air from the cracked window frame settle around me for a moment. Robert Garrett found me there about 10 minutes later. He stood next to me at the window. We didn't say anything for a while. Below us, Columbus went about its business, a delivery truck double-parked, two women crossing against the light, a man walking a large dog with the focused inefficiency of a dog that has opinions about pace. Robert said, "Daniel would have wanted to be here for this." I said I thought Daniel was the reason it was happening at all. Robert nodded slowly. He said he'd been thinking about something Daniel had told him about a year before he died. He said Daniel had come home for a Sunday dinner and had seemed quieter than usual, not unhappy, just carrying something. And after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table where he'd grown up, Daniel had said, "Dad, do you think it's possible to finish something for someone who doesn't know you started it?" Robert had told him he thought that was exactly how most important things got finished. I stood at that window and thought about a 31-year-old man asking his father a question at a kitchen table. And I thought about a 7-year-old girl asking her father a question at a diner counter over blueberry pancakes. And I thought about how the questions children ask their fathers are almost never really about what they appear to be about. I thought about Catherine's voice on the phone. He would have been my brother. In the months that followed the arraignment, the case expanded in the way that well-built cases do when institutional momentum is behind them. 3 of the 12 families on Daniel's timeline were identified and contacted. 2 of them responded. One of those led to a biological mother in her late 50s in Zanesville, Ohio, who had spent 30 years believing her son had died at birth, a story she had been told by hospital staff and had never had reason or resources to investigate. Her name was Linda. I won't give her last name. She deserves that privacy. Patricia told me about her because Linda had asked, through the victim advocate's office, whether the biological father of one of the other identified children might be willing to speak with her. She said she didn't know what she was looking for exactly. She said she just needed to know she wasn't the only one. I called her on a Tuesday evening. We talked for almost an hour. She had a quiet voice and a laugh that appeared unexpectedly in the middle of a sentence when something struck her as both painful and absurd, which grief sometimes produces in people who are fundamentally honest about what they're feeling. At one point she said, "I keep thinking all those years I thought I was alone in this. And the whole time there were other people carrying the same thing." I told her that was true. And I told her that the reason she wasn't alone in it anymore was because a young man she'd never met had spent 2 years making sure the truth had somewhere to land. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me about him." So I did. I told her about the box on the dining room table, the color-coded timeline, the small, even handwriting, the dog named Archie, the bad science fiction movies, the question he had asked his father at a kitchen table about finishing something for someone who doesn't know you started it. I told her about the letter. Not the contents, those are mine, but the fact of it, the care that had gone into it, the courage that had gone into the decision not to send it until everything else was in place. She said, "He sounds like someone who got the important things right." I said he did. "The trial is scheduled for October. I intend to be there." Patricia Okafor has told me the case is strong. Claire Novak has told me the financial evidence is stronger than they initially projected the dissolved LLC, the brokerage liquidation, the wire transfers. All of it has been traced with enough specificity to satisfy the evidentiary standard. Sylvia Brandt's cooperation has held. A second hospital employee has since agreed to testify. Gerald Foss's attorney continues to file motions. The motions continue to be addressed by the structure that was in place before any of this began. The law does not bend to performance. Evidence does not negotiate with assumption. Some people spend their lives believing that silence gives them ownership of what they've taken. That if no one comes looking, the transaction is complete. That a name on a forged document carries the same weight as a life actually lived. It doesn't. What Gerald Foss did not account for, what none of them accounted for, was a child who grew into a man who needed to understand the foundation he was standing on. A man who was patient enough and precise enough to spend 2 years building a structure out of documents and databases and quiet determination, and careful enough to make sure that structure would stand even after he wasn't there to stand beside it. You can't take what was never yours to give away. I still sit at my kitchen table in the mornings with my coffee. The backyard is the same. The oak tree Catherine was born under is the same. The fence I put up in 1998 has a section near the gate that needs replacing. I keep meaning to get to it. Catherine came to visit last month with her husband and the kids. We had dinner, and the grandchildren were loud in the way that children are when they feel safe enough to be loud, which is a kind of gift I've learned not to take for granted. After dinner, Catherine found me standing at the window looking at the yard, and she stood next to me the same way Robert Garrett had stood next to me in that courthouse corridor, and she said, "Are you okay, Dad?" I told her I was getting there. She put her arm through mine the way she used to when she was small, and we stood there for a while looking out at the yard and the oak tree and the fence that needs fixing. Susan called the following Sunday. She had found out about the Ancestry database, how Daniel had found her profile, how that thread had led him to the confirmation he needed. She was quiet about it in that particular way she has. That means she is processing something large. Finally, she said, "He found us, didn't he? He just never came all the way to the door." I said that was one way to think about it. She said, "I think he was protecting us." I told her I thought she was right. Daniel's letter is in the same shoebox as the divorce papers from 1993. I know that's an odd place to keep it, but it seemed right somehow to put the end of one story and the beginning of another in the same box, filed together, documented, part of the same record. I take it out sometimes and read it, not often, but sometimes. I got to the last line again recently, the part where he says, "I think you would have been worth knowing," and I sat there at the kitchen table in the early morning light, and I thought about all the things I would have told him, the things a father tells a son over the course of a lifetime. The ordinary things mostly. How to read a room. How to know when to push and when to be still. How the fastest explanation is rarely the complete one. How patience, applied correctly, is not passivity, it is precision. He seemed to have figured most of that out on his own. I have a photograph now. Robert and Carol gave it to me when I visited Westerville the second time. Daniel, at about 25, standing in front of a building he had apparently worked on. Smiling in that slightly self-conscious way people smile when someone insists on taking their picture. He had my jaw. The particular set of it. I hadn't expected that. I keep the photograph on the kitchen windowsill, next to the coffee maker, where I'll see it in the morning. That seems like the right place for it. There are 11 other people on that timeline who are still looking for answers. Some of them know it, some of them don't yet. The work of finding them, of making sure Daniel's map leads somewhere real, is ongoing. The DA's office is involved. The victim advocate's office is involved. There are organizations, I've learned, that specialize in exactly this kind of reconnection work. Patricia has connected me with 2 of them. I am not a young man. I'm 63 years old and I drive a sensible car and I keep a notepad by the phone and I have a fence section near the gate that needs replacing. I am not built for drama. I am built for procedure, for patience, for following the trail where it goes rather than where I want it to go. Daniel understood that about me before I knew he existed. That's the part I keep coming back to, that somewhere in all those months of research and documentation and careful, deliberate work, He had looked at the shape of who I was and decided that I was someone who would do something with what he left behind. He was right. I intend to make sure he stays right. If you've stayed this far, if stories about quiet persistence and the particular weight of truth found too late and perhaps just in time resonate with you, you're welcome to stay for the next one. There are more stories like this one, patient ones, the kind where the resolution is not loud but it is real, and it is earned, and it holds. That's the only kind worth telling.